All right, it's 10:05, so let's get this meeting started. Um,
Would you like me to, Julie?
yes, please.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can
You
hear you.
can? Okay. So my name is Rachel Elkins. I am the University of California Cooperative Extension Pomology Farm Advisor Emeritus. Actually, I officially retired July 1st, 2020. And but I am returned to work pretty much the same day that I retired to continue working with the pear and some with the walnut industries as well in Lake and Mendocino counties and statewide in California for pears. As um, I am the remaining pear academic that has the major part of my program in pear in the state of California. And as luck would have it, I was very privileged to work with a master's student from UC Davis, Juliana Wu. She and her major professor, Dr. Astrid Volder in the Department of Plant Science, teamed up with one of our Lake County growers, David Mostyn, to work on to develop information on using a cover crop, the effect of cover crops on rooting systems and soil health in David's organic pear orchard. And David is on the program and he will give you a more in-depth um, introduction to his orchard practices later in the session. But for now, we welcome you um, to our quote unquote virtual field tour of David's trial in and Juliana's trial in Kelseyville, Lake County, California. And if there are, this meeting is being recorded. And if there are any questions, you can put them in the chat. And there will be a question and answer session later. I would just like to, in addition to Astrid, who is on the program, and Juliana and David, I would like to acknowledge Julia Stover Blackburn of the Department of Plant Science, the UC Fruit and Nut Research and Information Center, who is part of our team producing this meeting and will be helping moderate the chat and question and answer sessions. And let's see, and of course, Juliana will talk a little bit more and Astrid, but this trial could not be done without the support of the California Department of Food and Agriculture Healthy Soils Initiative, and it was done under their auspices. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Astrid and we will talk to you all soon. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel. I'm hoping you can all see my screen now. It says roots, rhizosphere, and cover crops, background information.
Yes.
Great. And then so I'm going to talk a little bit about roots first, maybe more than you've ever thought about roots, and then about how cover crops actually can benefit your root systems. And so we typically name roots the hidden half because those are the parts of the tree you cannot see, but they have very important functions for the tree in that they are the ones responsible for water and nutrient uptake and anchoring the tree. And they are exposed to a very heterogeneous environment that is pretty variable in terms of soil environment. Water is different in different locations, soil type. I mean, it's not uniform for a field at all. There are some predictable gradients, though. We know it gets warmer during the summer, so temperature gradients, annual and diurnal temperature gradients are predictable, as are rainfall gradients a little bit. So some things we do know, but what we really don't know a lot about is the zone right around the roots, which we call the rhizosphere. And it's called a rhizosphere because rhizo means root, and it's the sphere that's influenced right there by the root. And the idea behind soil health is that you are going to alter the rhizosphere and manage the rhizosphere to optimize the root system, with the assumption that if your root system functions perfectly well, that means your tree is going to be more healthy and you'll get more yield. So there's a lot of steps going from soil health to actual benefits in terms of yield. So I already mentioned the functions of the root system, and one major function that is usually not mentioned in this list is manipulating the rhizosphere, but the roots themselves actually have a huge impact on the rhizosphere as well. And this is where cover crops can have a large impact, because their root systems will also alter the rhizosphere around your tree. But just a little bit about water and nutrient uptake. That's being done by the finest roots that the tree has, and it's a function of the total root surface area that is exposed to both the water and the nutrients in the soil. And the finer or the thinner the roots, the more surface area there is. So it's really those most external roots of your root system that are doing the heavy lifting when it comes to water and nutrient uptake. It's not those big roots. The big roots are very important in that they transport the water up towards the tree, but they are like the large pipes in your water uptake system. So we count when we talk about roots from the outside in. So we call the most external roots the primary roots. So it's kind of important to remember that, because sometimes people say, okay, the oldest roots are the primary roots. But in this case, the youngest roots are the primary roots. So here's an example. This is a pecan root system. And you see how much this root system here, let's see, you can hopefully see my pointer, looks like, if you would look at it from the top, perhaps like a river system, the water flowing down to smaller and smaller, or sorry, the other way around, all the smaller ones contributing to the bigger and bigger river and eventually ending up in the tree. These roots here that are on the scanner, they are 0.1 millimeters in diameter. So there's really the very finest roots. On the right here, you see an example of a tree about to be transplanted and how much of those fine roots there are. When we talk about mature trees, though, I skipped through this. When we talk about mature trees, most of the biomass, here's proportion of mass, is sitting in the higher order roots, so in those much coarser roots. So if we actually were to sample a root system out in the field, we'll find that almost all the energy of the tree standing at that moment in time is sitting in those big roots. But the length or surface area is all in those finest roots. And so they're the ones that are doing all the lifting. And you can kind of see that on these scans, right? I mean, if you would add up all the surface area associated with these fine roots, it is much, much more than you would have associated with the coarse roots. Now, the fine roots only live for a couple of months. They quickly suck all the nutrients and water out of the surrounding soil, and particularly for the nutrients, that's important. We call that a nutrient depletion zone. And so there's no point in having them live more than a couple of months. And then you have to make new fine roots to explore a new zone to suck out all the nutrients. And that means that your soil actually has to support that root growth, has to support production of new fine roots all the time. And a hospitable soil for root growth would have water, but it also should have a lot of oxygen, because the growth of these roots requires a large amount of root respiration, and that needs oxygen to actually make new roots. So soil properties are really important in determining the dynamics of these fine roots and how they grow, and thus actually in how your tree is going to be successful in water and nutrient uptake. So then we get to the soil environment. There's two properties that we tend to talk about most of the time. It's texture, which is a classification of your soil. It's the proportion of different sized particles in your soil. And then the one that is perhaps more important is structure, is how those particles are attached together. Because how they're attached together determines how much water, oxygen, and nutrients will flow through that soil and how easily. And we know that that's all roots need. I mean, you can grow a plant on hydroponics as long as you provided water, oxygen, and nutrients. Those are the three main components that a soil environment would need to provide to a root system to grow perfectly. I put some examples down here as to how variable soils are. Now, there's lots of gradients and over time, and also spatially in terms of moisture and temperature. Some things vary by depth, some things vary diurnally, even like soil temperature in the topsoil layers, whereas the soil environment deeper is much more stable. So there's a lot going on in that soil environment. And all of this also affects microbial activity. So those root systems that seem so kind of boring, really, are sitting in a super dynamic environment, and actually are fairly dynamic because they have fluxes of root production all the time. So the soil, and this is from just a straightforward textbook, basically provides a lot to the root system. Part of it is it's a environment where energy is exchanged. So there's soil temperature that has a big effect. So heat storage, water, key one, right? That's the one that most people try to manage as much as they can. There's exchanges of gases, and the one that we should be most concerned with when it comes to roots is the amount of oxygen going down towards the root system. You do want to allow a decent flow of oxygen into the roots. And then there's this whole cycle of organic matter breaking down and providing nutrients to the tree. Soil, and so this is soil building and the carbon and nutrient cycles. So that's where cover cropping can come in a lot. Cover cropping can help you build soil, improve carbon and nutrient cycles. And by doing that, they increase the gas exchange rates through the soil. So they make it easier for oxygen to flow towards your roots. And they improve water holding capacity as well as drainage of your soils. So I just wanted to say something about all of these components in the soil that are really active. When there is a lot of biological activity, that uses oxygen. So not just the roots that use oxygen, but a lot of the microbes in the soil use lots of oxygen as well. And the more active the biology of the soil, the greater the amount of CO2 released by all these organisms. Same as humans, right? If we breathe in, we use oxygen, we breathe out, we put out extra CO2. So all of these organisms in the soil do the same thing. And we tend to measure soil health. One of the parameters that we measure is how much CO2 is being released as a measure of how active all of the biological components in that soil are. And if you get more organic matter in your soil, then these organisms will get more carbon, and that's the building block for growing more microorganisms. So once you get more organic matter, you'll get more biological activity. So it's just a straightforward nutrient cycle. What happens is cover crop residues and minerals, they get broken down. Either you mow them or you incorporate them in the soil or some way. They become part of the soil system as organic matter, and they release nutrients, and those nutrients can be taken up by the roots. Your plant will grow more, there will be more organic matter into the soil. So in nature, this is a never-ending cycle where the plants basically feed themselves, right? Each year they have dead material, gets incorporated in the soil, it breaks down, and then the plants will grow again. So by adding a cover crop to your orchard, you're basically increasing the importance of this cycle and hopefully reducing your reliance on putting in on fertilizer. So I mentioned the rhizosphere. It's very heavily influenced by the root. The root takes up oxygen, takes up water and nutrients, so that changes the soil right around the root. The root itself actually compacts the soil around it a little bit, so that changes the properties of that soil. The root is releasing old cell layers and it's dying, and so it's adding a tons of organic matter to the immediate environment of the root. It exudes compounds, acids in particular, organic acids, but also sugars. And then by doing this, particularly these two, Those are a carbon source for microbes. So the zone right around the root, and it's easily decomposable. So the zone right around the root is a very active zone when it comes to bacteria and fungi. And they vary by how active the root is. So if the roots get older, they become less active, and also the material changes that they put in the soil. So the microbial community along the root axis actually changes as well. So here's just some examples of that. Hopefully you've all heard of plant growth promoting bacteria, helping plants in part sometimes by extending the root system to enhance nutrient uptake, or by protecting the root from pathogens, very important one. But there can also be some problems. Sometimes you might be stimulating some fungi in the soil you don't want to have that may actually attack your plant. So it's not always positive, but most of the time it is. It's already mentioned that all this biological activity in that root zone releasing CO2. So hopefully, I think Juliana might show some CO2 data later about how active the soils were. So we'll just a point about the fact that we really need oxygen. Oxygen, when your soil is waterlogged, oxygen moves 10,000 times slower through water than it does through air. So you want a lot of pores in your soil that do not have water in them so that the oxygen can flow towards the roots. If your soil is waterlogged, the roots will get deprived of oxygen very fast. The first thing that happens is root growth stops. And then if it happens for a prolonged amount of time, then the roots will actually die because they can no longer respire. Cover crops do a lot of things, can do a lot of things, as do plants in nature, right? They add nitrogen, and particularly if they're legumes, a lot of people put in legumes to add more nitrogen. They improve this property called soil aggregation. Soil aggregation is how well all of the soil particles hold together, and a better aggregated soil has more larger and smaller pores. So it has overall more pore space and a greater variety of pores. So that allows some water to be held in the small pores, but oxygen to flow through the large pores. And I just, in terms of time, we'll kind of skip through all of these, but there's a lot of benefits from having cover crops that are related to building up your soil and improving your soil. And the assumption is if you do that, you are going to improve the environment for the roots, and then the tree overall will be more healthy. Also want to talk about this. So all of these are related to adding organic matter, but the roots themselves also engineer the soil as they grow through the soil. They leave large root channels. And so by doing that, they are helping with drainage and aeration of your soils as well. And several studies out there about the amount of nitrogen. It depends a little bit on what kind of cover crop mixture you have, but it's in this case, it was in Spain in olive with vetch, and they added at least 5 kilograms or up to 5 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And second, it depended a little bit on the season, 10 here. So you can have substantial amounts of nitrogen being added to your orchard. And there's some disadvantages too. You shouldn't say that they're like fixing every problem. So there's some disadvantages, there's cost to it. They could reduce soil moisture depending on how much they overlap with your crop. And the one thing that's not here, but there could also be a frost risk. So organic matter is a very important component in soil aggregation. So a nice looking soil like this, those particles are being held together by bits and pieces of organic matter. And I might skip a little bit through this, but show you the drainage part. So it's through these bigger pores that are in between larger clumps of soil that the water will drain. And those are the macropores. It's the micropores that are holding water. And this is some information from Jim Walworth. He's a great soil scientist at the University of Arizona, and he made this animation. If you have a well aggregated soil, you will have clumps of soil that are then being held together again, but loosely held together. So this is this crumbly type soil. When it rains, the water will just flow through the soil and drain pretty quickly. If it's poor structure, then all of these big channels are being clogged and those heads of soil are falling apart. So in this case, when it rains, water will not flow through your soil very quickly and stay standing there. And this blocks oxygen. So oxygen can no longer diffuse into your soil because there's a layer of standing water. That kills the roots. So roots themselves, when they go through the soil though, they provide you with those nice channels. They grow through the soil and eventually they will die and they leave a channel where they were growing. And so having a cover crop adds tons and tons of macropores to your soil and should improve drainage. The other component that is really encouraged by having cover crops is fungal presence, and the fungi, the hyphae from the fungi really clump the soil particles together, and again, allowing for adjacent soil particles to have enough distance from each other that those macropores can drain. I'm gonna kind of skip through some of these, but there's some information out there that's pretty cool. And this is some really difficult experiments to do, but what these people did, and it shows very nicely in this picture, is they looked at the effect of this gel compound that is exuded by roots. And what they found is that it can hold up to 50 times its dry weight in water. So all of these roots here, and you can see the actual root growing here, it has higher moisture content itself. But notice that all around that root, the soil also is holding more water than the bulk soil, which is much more dry. And that's because the gel exuded by these roots actually holds more water. So it's another example of how roots change the soil properties and how the zone right next to the roots, the rhizosphere, has different properties than the bulk soil. These compounds that are being exuded not only help in water uptake of the roots, but they also can free up iron. And maybe Juliana will talk a little bit about that later. And it encourages bacterial growth. And if you get a lot of decomposers, then those bacteria will break down organic matter and make more nutrients available to your plants. So just an example, this is the almond root system growing through time. So this is time 0. And this is 3 weeks later. And this is 6 weeks later. And you can see how quickly those roots kind of grow through the soil deeper and deeper, but also notice the color change. When those roots are white, they are much more active in exuding compounds than when they are brown. So here you see this part of the root system was initially white. 3 weeks later, it's brown. So there's a limited time that the roots are really active. So we want to have a soil that supports constant growth of roots through the soil. Similar, you can kind of see it here, much more detail. This is in a weekly time step. You see the root appearing here. 1 week later, you see the root is now here and it has lots of side roots. It's still white. So it's very active in nutrient uptake. But then notice week 3, it starts getting brown. It's getting suberized, protected from the soil. The root tip is now all the way at the bottom. And so it has to keep moving like that constantly. So there's rapid turnover, and eventually you'll see roots disappear even and die. And then more organic matter is added to the soil. So if we want to maximize the benefits of the soil system, then we want to make sure that we keep lots of carbon in the soil to support microorganisms, and we want to improve soil stability. And the best and easiest way to do that is using organic matter inputs, which is coming in most cases from your cover crop, which will have several benefits, including aeration, as well as improving water holding capacity, drainage. And these are some much more tenuous. A lot of people are working on it. If we can manipulate microbial communities for specific functions, we might even be able to reduce pesticides use, and we could have specific microbes for nutrient cycling, etc. So when you plant a cover crop, reasonable expectations that you could have in the short term is that it will have an immediate effect on your microbial diversity, as those plants are immediately going to put out easily decomposable carbon. When you have legumes in there, you could expect an immediate increase in nitrogen availability, and all these cover crop roots will start growing through your soil and start engineering your soil. So that would happen in the short term. But you have to keep it up pretty long to actually increase soil organic matter content, because in California, that organic matter decomposes rather fast. So we're talking about decades of continuous cover cropping to really, really improve your soils. But when you do, you can expect better water holding capacity, less problems with compaction, improved drainage, improved cation exchange capacity, and overall much more healthy soil environment. And that can, longer term can be anywhere between five years and longer. So the conceptual idea is, and it's tenuous, so this is probably the most important part for growers. If you add cover crops, we will enhance microbial activity and we will improve the soil. With that, we assume we're going to improve root health and also root foraging and activity. So better root growth through that soil. And also the microbes will increase nutrient availability. Combination of this should increase nutrient uptake. Healthier roots and improved soil water status combined should improve water status, and meaning that it wouldn't be too wet or too dry. Combination of these two should benefit tree health, and hopefully in the end that will lead to a higher yield. Now that's a long pathway, but that's kind of the background behind the whole soil health premise and the cover cropping usage, is that eventually a healthier system should lead to greater yield. So with that, I want to stop. I think I lost a few minutes at the beginning, so I kind of made it within time. And I'll give it back for questions, etc. to Juliana or Julie. I don't know. Julia.
I think you're great. Perfect timing. If anyone has any questions, we have a couple of minutes. And if you think of anything later while anyone else is speaking, you can drop them in the chat and we'll make sure we get them to Astrid. So if anybody wants to speak up, go ahead and shout out. Or if you would like a moment to think about it, we can move forward and you can drop questions in the chat.
It's light from Spain, huh? Yeah, let's see. The olive one, a little fast. There we go. So the added veg as a cover crop. There are experiments using compost mulch as well, and that also works, but what you don't get if you use compost mulch is the benefits of the roots themselves actually engineering the soil. What you do get is additional organic matter being added, but it takes a long time for compost mulch to actually change the organic matter content of your soil.
Great questions. Oh, keep going. The question is, where would you apply the compost mulch?
Well, basically anywhere that you can put it except near the trunk. You should stay away from the trunk because you will be incorporating, you'll keep that zone there too moist, and you would actually set up the tree for increased diseases. So I'd stay at least a foot to 2 feet away from the trunk. It also depends on your irrigation system, of course, because your irrigation system has a huge impact on where your roots grow. So if you're sprinkler irrigated or micro sprinkler irrigated and you're watering the whole root zone, you could put the mulch in the whole root zone. If you're drip irrigated, the roots tend to congregate near the drips.
Is that true for cover crops also? They dry farm.
Oh, if you dry farm, you can expect the roots to basically be all throughout your orchard. So you could spread it everywhere in the orchard except stay away from the trunk.
And then another question, have you seen increased mite pressure with the taller cover crops?
I think I would have to leave that to Rachel because I usually don't get called out for farm calls. I don't know if Rachel.
Rachel?
Yes.
This question is being passed to you. Have you seen increased mite pressure with the taller cover crops?
Well, it depends on what is the composition of your cover crop. You know, cover crop, I mean, there's a wide definition, including growers that utilize indigenous or, native species, mixed cover of whatever species, which might be called weeds or whatever. And there are certain of those that do harbor mites, specifically some perennial weeds like if you have morning glory or something like that, or any kind of a cover that tends to build up mites, like bean crops or something like that, you can get mite movement. If they build up spider mites, they can move into the trees. But what's working in your favor is generally an active cover crop situation during when mites become a problem, which is in the heat of the summer. You have a cooler situation, which is does not build up mites like you do in a dry. If you're farming somewhere where you have a very hot situation, a dry situation, and you have a species that will build up spider mites, then yes, you do take the chance. Here where we are, and Dave can talk to you about that, are some of the pests that I will discuss, like such as thrips and some true bugs, I feel can be a bigger problem, but it all depends on where you're farming and the type of cover crop that you're choosing. The other side of the mites is that you're also building up beneficials that are, have a little bit of a lag time, but they do respond. Whether they respond fast enough to take care of spider mite jumping from a cover crop into a tree is that can vary with your situation as well. So it's not a straightforward thing. It's something that in your situation, you're going to have to see what happens.
Thanks, Rachel. We have one more question. In case of cover crop, what should be the clear zone around the trunk?
I think that depends on your management situation a little bit. Yeah, I would probably stay a foot away from the trunk, but no, it depends a little bit on how you are planning on managing your cover crop, because you have to think about how you're going to incorporate it into your soil later as well. You have to be able to mow it or disc it in.
Thank you very much, Astrid. I think we're going to move on to the next talk. If anyone else has any questions for Astrid and that they think of later, just make a note that it's for Astrid in the chat and I'll make sure it gets to her. I do want to make a note before we move on that there is still a poll up. If you haven't gotten a moment to fill it out, please make sure that you get to that. This is data that Juliana has been trying to make sure she gets from everyone. So thank you very much. And we're going to go ahead and move on.
Okay, I guess that's me. Correct? That's me?
Yes, I believe that's you.
Okay, so You're all going to have to, I did not prepare set slides for this, so I'm not going to be sharing my screen. I do have some resources that I'm going to show you toward the end of my comments. But I sort of pretended we're at a field meeting, and I probably wouldn't have slides at a field meeting. So I thought I would take the opportunity to just give you sort of my view on cover crops based on my experience as a farm advisor these past 30 plus years, and also going back to when I was a technician at UC Davis working for one of my first mentors, early mentors, Dr. Clyde Elmore, in the weed control botany department at UC Davis. And that was my introduction to cover crops. And it's was pretty important to me because it gave me a sort of the 30,000 foot view of what I considered to be important about cover crops, which is how they infect the entire orchard system. So I'm going to hold up a little edition of Cal Ag here. It goes back, it's July, August of 1989. And you can see here, there's a grower with a mower. He is mowing in an almond orchard. And inside there are multiple articles in there. And I feel like they represent something that I don't often see when people talk about cover crops, which is a very multi-pronged, multifaceted view of a cover cropping situation. So if you look at the index to these articles, and this edition is available if you go into California Agriculture website, into the archives, you can download this from everybody, and Juliana put that up there. And I'm just going to read the sections of this because I think it really does represent what a grower or somebody working with an orchard floor management situation needs to take into consideration, and it's not often done. So the articles in this issue are, the first one, it's a introduction, vegetation management systems in almond orchards. And we work with 4 different management systems, including planted 2 types of planted cover crops, a Zorro fescue and a perennial clover. Plant composition of orchard floors and your cover crop situation, your cover crop management, the types of cover crop you choose, your succession situation is certainly going to change over time, and it makes a huge difference in the outcomes. The management of navel orangeworm and ants, and this is an example of how your cover crop affects what sorts of insect species, and this came up in the questioning, and it will vary with your cropping system and your location. And this is just an example from almonds, what were important insects that had to be taken into consideration when looking at a cover crop. Orchard water use and soil characteristics, and I think Astrid covered that very well. And David will cover how your irrigation practices, your water availability, your water quality, and the characteristics, your texture and your the texture and your functionality of your soil, such as was discussed, makes a difference. And of course, then, and going back to the navel orangeworm and ants, what we also took data on disease pests, specifically the effect of the cover crop and the species on botrytis, blossom and fruit rot, and which ones might increase that. And then finally, we have an article in here called Almond Orchard Floor Management Costs. And cover crops are not free. They're free if what your cover crop is your native vegetation in your orchard that you're managing. But you also have costs incurred on managing those and the results of having those in the ground. But when you plant a cover crop, you are incurring cost, and you're going to have to see what your return on investment. And a lot of those are not direct, and they're not short term. And they're a lot of what Astrid discussed, but they also are going to take many years to see the benefit, and the standard cost study may not give you that. So that is a huge factor in whether a grower decides to keep a cover crop going for the years that it takes to see the benefits, because they are going to incur those costs. So with that, and if anybody's interested in that, I certainly encourage you. It was a 3-year trial. I think that the minimum, if you're working with cover crops, is 3 years. If you're working with trees at all, the minimum of doing anything to see any kind of result is 3 years. And you're probably looking more at a 5-year window. And if Juliana had had more opportunity to continue this with David, then I think that if these measurements were going to be taken over a longer period of time, that some of the results that were seen in this trial that Juliana were to discuss would be more enhanced, most likely, and there would be changes based on the seasonality of the situation. So these are some of the considerations you as a grower. I did look at the attendee list, and I see that it's all over the board, from California and around the world, and certainly in the United States. I'd have no idea what cropping system you're in, but I did recognize several. So I think, so it does, when I wrote down some factors, I think that these are the main ones that you have to take in mind. First of all, what is your cropping system? I already gave you an example in almonds. The biggest part of my work in pears, and over the years working with cover crops in different situations, they are going to vary. So if you're apples or anything else, or walnuts, you're going to also have your specific system. And I did talk a little bit, Astrid did mention, look, she showed a couple of slides of couple of different rootstocks. I believe it was Mariana versus Crimps, and the difference in their rootstock and their rooting situations. That's can be a big deal, because rootstocks play a huge factor in nutrient uptake and how their rooting systems grow in the soil. Some have shorter profile, some are more deep rooted, whether you use a seedling or a vegetative rootstock, and how they are going to develop in your soil and your location, and how they're going to interact with your cover crop. That is going to make a difference in what you see in your situation. There was a question about how far back from the trunk. One of the big issues that comes up is, when do you plant a cover crop in relationship to the age of the tree? I am very, very protective of young trees. I do not like competition to the tree when they're before they develop fruiting in the first 4 or 5 years. I'm very, very, very protective of the tree. I don't like to have a competitive situation where orchard floor management, the orchard floor vegetation is competing with the tree. So the younger the tree, the wider the space should be between the trunk and where your cover crop is. As the tree grows older, the canopy develops, the root system is more developed. Then you can start to bring your cover crop in closer to the trunk. I don't like to see anything less than about 12 inches, but David will talk to you about his situation. It's very difficult. Not to mention, if you're an organic grower and you're not using herbicides, to clear a clean strip away from the tree. David has a lot of experience in developing his strips and how he can keep them intact. But the younger the tree, the less competition, and maybe even consider not seeding a thick cover crop until your tree is somewhat developed, when you're able to tolerate more competition for water and nutrients. We talked a little bit about pests. One of the, and I'll talk a little bit about the pear situation later, is it's not just your pest situation, but your fruit quality. If you're in a situation where clean fruit, the quality of the fruit as deemed in the marketplace calls for clean fruit, then cover crops can present some impediment to that, because you're increasing humidity, you're increasing harboring some of the in the case of pears, you're harboring some bacteria that fosters fosters buildup of indolacetic acid on the pear fruit. we find that during the russet formation situation, when russet could form, that a clean orchard floor and certain cover crops, namely grasses, should be perhaps avoided. So again, it goes back to your cropping situation. Your fertility and your irrigation needs, and Juliana is going to talk to you about specifically. She looked at iron chlorosis in pear. One of the, so what sorts of specific fertility issues you have, and also your irrigation situation. Are you dry land? Is there competition for water during the growing season? Are you able to irrigate a cover crop? You're growing two crops. You're growing two crops when you have a cover crop, your commodity and also your cover crop. You have to balance the needs of those two crops over the course of the growing season. I want to mention pollination. Although our pear industry, our pears in California are grown with vegetative parthenocarpy, i.e. we don't put bees in our orchards, we don't need them. But if you do have the need for bees in your orchard and you are pollinating your orchard, you know, bees are attracted to certain cover crop flowers. And if your commodity is less attractive than your cover crop, you need to balance, you know, how to make sure you're optimizing your pollination situation for your tree versus your cover crop. So that's your cropping system. Your location's very important. I did mention dry land. Well, I won't mention that. I will mention location. So are you growing in a long season growing area, a short season growing area? We have a short season up here in Lake County. We're in the mountains. We grow in the mountains. If you're down in the Sacramento Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, you have a very long growing season, a much milder growing season. And I think it gives you a lot more leeway on when you can seed a cover crop, your cover crop, the growing season for it, as well as your tree and your cutoff time at the end. When you have a curtailed growing season, you have a later planting potential for not being able to get your cover crop until later because you're still harvesting your crops. And then you can have a shortened growing season for both commodities and being cut off earlier because of cold. You have cold later in the season and we have cold earlier in the season. So that affects your stand development. And your location will also affect what cover crops you can plant. You have to talk to your dealer and find out for your growing season, for your location, what is the best mix that you're most likely to get success. Don't forget, you're spending money on this. You want to make sure that the product that you're planting is where you're getting the best bang for your buck. And the other thing that a growing season that your location will do, and Astrid mentioned this, and I was really glad, it is not easy to build up organic matter in your soil. And in our low organic matter California soils, to get 2%, above 2% is doing really, really well. We have a hot summer, and we have a great deal in our sandier soils. To build up organic matter is not easy. It's going to take a lot of bulk and a lot of time and a lot of effort to build up organic matter. Now, if you're in the Sacramento Delta and you're growing down there, you already have much higher organic matters than we would have in most of our soils in, say, the San Joaquin Valley or even up here. You have more of your peat and but even there, where the pears are, they're not as high as, say, they are into the, some of the peat areas. So building up organic matter, your potential, it differs with your location. And in California, we have a hard time building up organic matter. The third, besides cropping system location, your management choices. What irrigation system are you on? Are you flooding? Are you flooding your orchard? Are you sprinkler, solid set sprinkler? Are you using drip, micro sprinklers? All of those are going to, you're managing two crops. You're going to have to irrigate your cover crop, and you're going to have to irrigate your commodity. In how most of the growers, many of the growers up here have lifted their micro sprinkler irrigation lines up onto the trunk so that they could get by with weed whackers or other hand taking care of their strips by hand, and maybe doing some lifting them out so they can do some cross mowing. So that's important. Dry land versus irrigated. Dry land with cover crop is very difficult to get a good cover crop stand, but get it down before you have to remove it for frost protection, because you don't have water for frost protection. And so dry land situations are more difficult for developing a complete cover crop system. Irrigation equipment, spray equipment, timing of when you mow it down for frost, when you plant it, how you plant it, whether you use a drill or broadcast. David can go into that. Again, I want to bring up the situation with frost. Timing is very important so that you optimize your frost protection. So some of my observations: cover crops do a lot to open up your soil. The oxygen, I cannot stress how poor oxygen in soil retards tree growth. So if cover crop can open up your soil and provide oxygen, that is a huge benefit. Tree age, I already talked about. What pest situation are you talking about? And one of the ones I really want to bring up is vertebrates. One of the biggest problems we have with cover crops is you can't see what's going on underneath them. And I've seen tremendous gopher situations, some vole situations, and growers don't even know what's happening because they can't see the mounds anymore. The gophers, you don't have to see the mounds for them to be active. They can move around quite well underneath all that vegetation and be chewing away just fine. So you need to be able to monitor your vertebrate pest situation with a cover crop. And this is especially a problem if your cover crops are growing right up into the trees. Thrifts and true bugs can be a problem. Cover crops harbor thrifts, and when the cover crop dries up, if it dries up, they will move up into the tree. And true bugs such as grass bugs, we already talked about bees. I talked about fruit quality, growing season. And just to finish up, I was just going to show you some other resources that we have. Here is cover crops in California agriculture. That was one of our first publications on cover crops. It was also developed in Spanish. This cover cropping in vineyards, even if you're a tree grower, it's going to have excellent information for you. Now, UC doesn't provide the only good information. This is from the Sustainable Agriculture Network, Managing Cover Crops Profitably. The National Agriculture Library has some nice indexes and keeps track of literature on cover crops. Here's one that they did. This is an older one, but you can look on their website for the National Ag Lab. Another good organization is the Soil and Conservation, Soil and Water Conservation. They did a whole issue on cover crops. And if you look in this journal and with the collaborating organizations, they have some information. And then they're not producing much anymore, but I think their stuff is IPNI, the International Plant Nutrition. They have some good resources for cover cropping on their website, probably in their archive section. And then I always look to my Western Fertilizer Handbook and various agronomy handbooks for some reference tables and things like that. People always ask me about nitrogen in cover crops. There is something that we call the Rule 16, and it was developed by Bill Williams, and it gives you an idea of how to figure out how much nitrogen your cover crop is contributing. And that little formula is available in some of our publications that I talked about. So I think that's all I have. And I think Dave is really going to give you a good, from the grower perspective, on managing a cover crop for your situation.
Thank you,
you.
Rachel. I managed to put a couple of those resources into the chat. A couple of them I wasn't quite fast enough. But
It's
if
okay.
anyone-
We can do that.
I was going to say, if anyone is interested in any of them in particular, we'll make sure we get the information. We are running a little bit behind. I did see one question. Wasn't sure if you answered this one yet about the relationship between cover crops and russet formation.
Oh, okay. That is something that is particular. I haven't seen work in apples, but there's been extensive work done by our colleague, Dr. Steve Lindau from the University of California at Berkeley, and who has worked for many, many years in the pear industry. And some of the growers have always noticed that if they use a fungicide, such as Xyram or some of our other Mancozeb, some of our other scab fungicides, that we have also have gotten data that we can reduce russeting. Well, why is that? And one of the factors in russeting in pears is certain Pseudomonas syringae or russet-inducing bacteria, which basically build up indole acetic acid, IAA, and causes lenticel rustting on pears. Now, certain cover crops, mainly grasses, they foster a bigger population of the russet-inducing bacteria, whereas some of the legumes do not do this, and also clean orchard floor. So the choice of your cover crop will affect the flora, the bacterial composition that then induces a higher rate of russeting on the pear itself. So this was done over quite a few years in California pears. And so growers went to basically a low till or no till situation over frost season for a cleaner. The other thing besides the russet inducement was creating a more frost prone situation and getting more frost damage. So when we do fire blight experiments with some of these antagonistic bacteria, we always took russet and frost data in order to see the effects of these materials on reducing frost and russeting, which they do, such as Blightban, which is a competitor to the Pseudomonas bacteria that causes russeting and increases frost damage.
Thanks, Rachel. I think that we are running out of time. So if anyone has any further questions for Rachel, please put them in the chat and I'll make sure they get to her. And let's move on. I know David's going to have a brief introduction before Juliana talks about her work, and then we're going to go back to some questions for David. So let's move on. Thanks, Rachel.
Welcome.
David, I think you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
There you go. Can you hear me
Perfect.
now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, there you go. Okay, I am David, and the orchards behind me were planted roughly 60 to 70 years ago, except for the old orchard, which is over 100 years old. Before they were pear orchards, they were livestock, hay and grain fields. So the volunteer grasses are a mix of their previous use. My first experience 35 years ago with cover crops was in my walnuts with water compaction and very low organic material. So I got a UC cover crop book and put in purple vetch and oats, and in 3 years totally changed the hard pan. Where I would irrigate, I would have in one part of the orchard a quarter-acre lake, and in 3 years, same irrigation application, same time of the year, it was totally changed. So my first 20 years of pear production were conventional. My last 20 have been transitioned into organic, which I am now 100%. The issues with that was being able to put enough nitrogen on with the compost material I've been using now. it has pretty much addressed that. However, the use of the, excuse me, of uh, cover crops specifically for fixing nitrogen or anything else in the pears, I have not done. So anyway, that's pretty much my introduction to the fields, and that's about all I got to say about them right now. I'll save it for later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. We're gonna be hearing some more from David. We'll have opportunities to have some questions for him. So let's move on with Juliana.
Oh, great. Thank you. So let me get my presentation up. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Yes, but we're seeing the presenter mode instead of the
Oh.
presentation mode. Do you want to? Perfect.
Does that
Oh,
work?
nope. Nope. Now we can see you and not the slideshow. Let's try.
Okay. Let me stop sharing. Okay, now I'm getting. Is it still sharing my screen?
That is not.
Okay, got you. Okay. There it is. All right.
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, hello. So I'm Juliana, and yeah, so I'll be presenting about my 3-year master's project that I worked with David, Rachel, and Astrid on. So we'll be talking about the effect of cover crops on soil health and iron deficiency in organic pear orchards. And so I'll be going over kind of our experimental results along with some of the concept behind it. And then since this is a virtual field day, we'll be going through some photos and videos that I've taken over the years of the cover crop. Cool. So let's jump into it. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm just gonna, like Astrid and Rachel already went over this, so I'll just briefly touch on what cover crops and soil health are. So cover crops, they're plants that are intentionally sown in the orchard alleyways or middles to improve soil function. And so on the right, I have some photos from different kind of orchards showing very different cover crops. So the first one on the left is a cover crop mix in a walnut orchard, and you can see many different types of species in it. You have grasses, you have forbs, you have legumes, and you have mustards, all with different functions. And so that'll give you more of a mixed benefit, yeah, from this cover crop. And then on the top right, you have an almond orchard with a pure stand of crimson clover. And so that's going to give you more of that legume nitrogen benefit and a more specific benefit. And then on the bottom right, we have an apple orchard with a perennial cover crop. And you can see like this cover crop, it's not as much of a pure stand, and it's also slightly less successful. There's dandelions that are slowly coming in, so more weed species that are taking over the cover crop. So there's a lot of different varying levels of success in cover crops, and yeah, what you can get out of it. And so as you can see from the photos, cover crops can be a really versatile toolbox. Yeah, that you can really shape what you get out of it depending what you want from it. You can pick your seed and how you want to manage it to get that benefit. And so Astrid mentioned these earlier. You can get nutrient management benefits, erosion control, better water infiltration, like David mentioned, habitat for beneficial insects, like Rachel mentioned, and so overall soil health benefits. And so if a cover crop's like well managed and successful, it can have these benefits. But if it's managed poorly, it can also result in increased costs for little reward, which Rachel touched on. Yeah, so this is just a little diagram. Kind of, there's always trade-offs. So some of the trade-offs would be increased cost from seed, including, and also like tractor time, managing, incorporating the cover crop. There's also the knowledge that's required. And so there's always that investment period before you can necessarily see benefits from the cover crop. And also acquiring knowledge to manage the cover crop well. And there's also problems, which include frost issues, pests such as gophers, and also like competition with your crop. So those are some potential trade-offs. But the potential benefits are that you can get increased nutrients, whether it's nitrogen or nutrient retention, thanks to increased soil health, increased water infiltration and retention, and increased soil health. So what is soil health? Just to briefly recap on that. So soil health is the improvement of soil quality and function as a living ecosystem. So soil as a living thing that provides benefit to the whole system in terms of function. And so Astrid went over this really well earlier. And so I'll just kind of briefly just go through. So she mentioned cover crops can really increase organic matter, and that can lead to a lot of soil health benefits, such as increased infiltration, water and nutrient retention, and improved soil structure. As she mentioned, the aggregation, and creating more micropores, which is what will help with the water and nutrient retention. And that organic matter can kind of act like a sponge to kind of provide these functions. And the plants themselves for the cover crop can increase infiltration by creating those root channels, kind of as you can see in the diagram on the bottom right, which Astrid also showed. So it creates those channels that then water can go through after the root dies. And the cover crop can also increase nitrogen through legumes, which makes it more available for the plant. And so the idea behind soil health and the push for soil health currently, and with kind of management practices like cover crops that promote soil health, is that it can kind of increase the like farm longevity by maintaining soil, and potentially increase the capacity of the farm to handle increased environmental variability, which we are kind of seeing year to year these days. So so those are kind of some of the benefits of cover crops and soil health. Okay, so one of the issues that I was interested in studying with my master's was iron chlorosis. Since I talked with Rachel and David, and they mentioned that iron chlorosis was a common issue in Lake County, and also throughout California and other parts of the world. And it's characterized by pale leaves with green veins, as you can see in the photos on the right, the top one being from pear leaves from our field, and the bottom being from prunes. It's characterized by those green veins, and then the interveinal chlorosis, so pale between the veins. And this is caused by, so it's a common issue in Lake County due to bicarbonate in water, as well as lime heavy calcareous soils. And I'll go in a bit more into kind of the chemistry behind that and why those things kind of inhibit the transport of iron in my next slide. So iron chlorosis is caused by low plant available iron in the soil, as well as iron transport limitations within the plant. And pears and woody crops are particularly susceptible to iron chlorosis. And so I was interested in seeing, beside just the cover crop soil health benefits, which have been fairly well studied, whether cover crops could be used to help with a specific production issue, such as iron chlorosis as well. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit into the biology of iron deficiency in pears. It's kind of a dense slide, so I'll just slowly make my way through it. And so first we're going to start right over here. And so iron as a nutrient, its availability is determined by pH. And so it's more available at lower pH. And the reason why bicarbonate and calcareous soils like lime kind of inhibit iron availability is because it's going to make the pH kind of sit a little higher on the pH scale where iron's less available. And also it kind of cancels out any hydrogen ions, which is what lowers pH. So it makes it hard to decrease pH to make the pH more available. So it buffers pH as well as making pH sit higher. And so that in those kind of conditions, iron is generally less available. As we'll see in kind of David's farm. And so, plants aren't just passively, sitting in these conditions. They're also trying to interact and change their soil environment. As Asher was mentioning, plants are constantly interacting with their environment through their roots as well as above ground. So I'm going to go through two strategies that plants employ in response to iron deficiency. So first is strategy 1, and then there's strategy 2. So strategy 1 is employed by pears and legumes, and it's a more acid-based, more pH-based strategy. And so what they do is they release these organic acids through their roots into the rhizosphere, and by changing kind of the local pH just around the roots, they can try to increase the availability of of iron, since the pH is lower. And that'll make it more available, the iron, so that it'll change from Fe3 to Fe2. So Fe2 is more available for plant uptake compared to Fe3. And so the plant will be more easily able to uptake the iron with this strategy. And strategy 2 is more pH independent, and it's employed by grasses such as oats. And what they do is they release chelators that are good at going into the soil and grabbing the iron and binding with it into a complex that's easy for the plant to take and can move through the soil profile. So those are kind of the two strategies that are employed. And with our cover crop mix, we had both legumes and grasses. So we're kind of hoping to have both those strategies present in our cover crop. And so iron transport is fairly complex in plants, since it has there's two different spots where pH within the plant have to be at the right level. Otherwise, you'll get that interveinal chlorosis, or won't be able to move through the tissues. And there's also the reactivity of iron that plants have to deal with. So within the plant, it changes between Fe2 and Fe3 at multiple stages. So just getting it into the plant isn't good enough. You have to also think about how it transports through the plant. So that is kind of what the diagram on the right is showing. So in the root, you're going to want the lower pH so that the iron can get into the cells of the roots, so that they can then get into the xylem. But in transport in the xylem, the plant actually changes it back to Fe3 just to limit kind of the reactivity of iron while it's going through the plant. And so it has to go back to Fe3, which is less soluble, less reactive. And then once it gets to the leaf, if it's not able to make that that reaction back to Fe2, that's when you'll see the interveinal chlorosis, where you'll get the green veins, like the iron's in the veins, but it's not able to get into the rest of the leaf tissue because it's stuck in that Fe3 form, which is less soluble. So it's, yeah, so iron's very interesting kind of micronutrient biologically and also to manage. Cool. All right, and then this is kind of the conceptual diagram that we had for our experiment. So, you know, we have 2 pear trees and then we have the cover crop in the middle. And so the cover crop comprised of grasses and legumes, you know, will have these benefits of inputting biomass, whether it's through, you know, roots dying, or also when it's incorporated or mowed, terminated. When it's live, it'll also have that root exudation of the chelators, organic acids, changing the soil environment. And this will add to soil organic matter, and it'll stimulate microbial activity that will also, so microbes are also releasing chelators and organic acids. So that's also another avenue beside the plant specific ones. And so all these things together can increase iron availability. And, you know, through that, hopefully it'll increase root uptake of iron by the pear tree. And at the end of the day, like decrease iron chlorosis would be the main goal, the end goal. So that was kind of the concept behind our experiment. Cool. All right, so going into the experimental design. So this was in David's 60-year-old Bartlett pear orchards. They're on Bachellifolia rootstock, and they were transitioned to organic in 2011. And the soil texture for the fields that we were in were clay and clay loam. So our treatments were mowed natural vegetation control, since this is an organic system, and our cover crop was a grass legume cover crop. And so the cover crop was sowed in like spring, early summer, and terminated before harvest. And so the cover crop mixes that were seeded was a BioBuilder mix that had a larger percentage of grasses, so 40% oats, 10% veg, 20% peas, 30% bell beans. And then the soil builder focused just on legumes, so 20% veg, 35% peas, 45% bell beans. And yeah, and then I have pictures of those different cover crop species below, just for personal identification. Yeah, but we did experience some cover crop establishment issues, so we combined the cover crop treatments just to a cover crop treatment field and the control field. And so we will go into that. Okay, so I pulled this photo off the Soil Web, which is a great resource for kind of seeing what soil characteristics are for a given location. And so now we're going to go to like the virtual field day mode. So we're just going to imagine that, you know, we're at David's farm right now looking at these 2 fields. And so yeah, so we had one field was our control and one field was our cover crop treatment. So there are 2 adjacent fields, but different fields. And so we'll highlight those differences. So yeah, the cover crop field was clay soil, primarily comprised of Clear Lake soil type. And then the control was a clay loam, comprised mainly of coal clay loam. So yeah, so there are slightly different soil types. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. And then here's a side-by-side comparison of the 2 different fields, how they looked. So the control on the left is, yeah, it was mowed natural vegetation. So, so that's what it looked like. And then on the right, we have the cover crop field, which was seeded with the cover crop and left unmowed. And so this is right before the cover crop was terminated. Yeah, so you can see that there are slight differences between the spacing and orientation of the orchards as well. Okay. All right, so we're gonna go through a little kind of like photo virtual cover crop field tour. And so these are a combination of David's photos along with my photos over the years, and just kind of highlighting, different stages of the cover crop and kind of machinery that David has used to manage the cover crop. Cool. So this first photo is taken by David, and so that's his spray rig for kind of scale. And so we have this mustard and the cover crop in the foreground, kind of, so pretty tall. But just the cover crops that I mentioned, the mix didn't include mustard, so it's also interesting to see what you get from your seed providers. So pure seed mix, also important. Cool. So this is the cover crop machinery that we used. So for the first 3 years of the cover crop, David used the seed spreader to spread the seed, and then kind of work it in through like some light disking. And then, so this past year, he used the seed drill. Yeah, so that kind of, can, and I have a video of it, work that into the ground directly without having to disturb the soil as much as with spreading and disking. Cool. So yeah, those are the two kind of different options we used. Okay, and then, okay, so I'm gonna put up a seed drill video now that I took. Okay. All right. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so be ready to be amazed. Cool. So yeah, so that's the seed drill, and it kind of let's see. Yeah, I'll just go back right here where we can kind of see more of the inside of the machinery. So you can see right here, there's the green little slots. And so the seed's going to be coming in through the holder and then going through these and feeding down here. And there's slight little blades right in front of the wheels that are gonna, work the seed or spread the soil, put the seed, and then the wheels kind of cover them back up. So I have a photo of one of David's orchards after the cover crop started coming back up. So let me get back to my slides. Okay. All right. Yeah. So that's kind of what it looks like when the cover crop starts coming back up from a seed drill. So very nice and uniform. Cool. So that's kind of how a seed drill works. Okay. So here we have a fava bean germinating about a month or so after the cover crop was, and this was with the spreader. Yeah, and so this was in December 2020 for that cover crop. And so this is the same cover crop, but months later. So now it's April 2020. Wait, sorry. Okay, this is December 2019. Okay. So now we're in April 2020, and yeah, so that's the same cover crop. It's the oat, fava bean, vetch, and pea cover crop. And in the foreground, you can see the pea plant and vetch and a bunch of oats. Okay, and let me know if I'm lagging at all. So yeah, and so this is the cover crop, and so we got a pretty nice stand that year. And this is same cover crop but more panned out. So this is during pear bloom, and that is kind of the cover crop, yeah, spread over the orchard floor. Okay, and so now we're bringing it back to iron chlorosis, and one of the reasons we're putting this cover crop in, or wanted to study it, So both of these photos are taken from David's field. And so on the left was kind of the tree that was our experimental tree that was showing the worst iron chlorosis symptoms. And so it has what I mentioned earlier, pale leaves, interveinal chlorosis. And yeah, like you can see the green veins very clearly in the photo on the right. Yeah, that's gonna, bless you, gonna get in the way of fruit development and other functions of the tree. So yeah, so now we're gonna hop into the experimental data. Great. So we're going to start more with the soil health side of things. So so we're starting with soil organic matter, since that is kind of a key indicator of soil health, and kind of getting those benefits, the soil health benefits that Astrid elaborated on. And so after 3 years, we saw minimal changes in soil organic matter, at least between the two fields in comparison. And so as you can see, so we sampled, at 3 different depths, all the way down to 23 inches. And Rachel mentioned that getting 2% for organic matter is already really good. And so you can see here, like David has 4% at the shallowest depths, which is, yeah, very impressive. And so, so we suspect that, since he already has very good organic matter from, his decades of practice, his decade of practice of organic management practices and yearly applications of chicken meal. Like we suspect that the compost is a greater determinant of kind of the soil organic matter percent than the cover crop did in terms of the 3 years that we were looking at. The the experiment. So this is kind of what we saw over the 3 years. And for the soil pH, so we were hoping that the cover crop would decrease the pH, through the release of organic acids. And so what we saw in 2018, and just 2018, we saw a decrease in soil pH while the cover crop was active, so before it was terminated. And so you can see, so on the y-axis is pH, and on the x-axis is the different depths. And the 2 different colors are the 2 different treatments. So the paler blue being the control, and the darker blue being the cover crop. So yeah, but while the cover crop was active, we saw a decrease in pH with the cover crop, which we thought was interesting. And after the cover crop was terminated, we saw that pH, the difference disappeared. And so this could potentially be attributed to the cover crop, or we also are potentially hypothesizing that it could be due to irrigation of bicarbonate water that then cancels out the effect of the cover crop and causes the pH to become the same. So yeah, that is what we saw in 2018. And for 2019 and 2020, we didn't see that pH decrease with the cover crop. In fact, we saw some slight pH increases, and yeah, generally the pH was about the same between the 2 treatments. Okay, and so of course, we got to talk about the roots. So generally the cover crop increased pear root length and mass per area of soil. So, so I have it highlighted right there. So it was about like a 2-fold increase of the pear roots length in the cover crop treatment. And yeah, like root data can be a little messy, so it was hard to get significance. But generally, we saw more root length, like fine root length in pear in the cover crop treatment, and more mass as well.
Juliana, you're lagging occasionally.
And I will
You
be
might
going
want to
into
turn
kind
your
of
video off.
the iron side of things. Oh, is it lagging really bad?
It's just occasional. I think this will help.
Okay, yeah, I'll just turn off my camera and let me know if that helps.
Seems better so far.
Okay, great. Oop. Okay. Okay, so back to where I was. Okay, so we're going into the iron side of the story now. And so what we generally found was that the soil iron availability was increased in the soils with the standing cover crop. And so all this data is before cover crop termination. So with the active cover crop stand, so in May of 2018 and 2019. And so the layout's the same for the figures. So we have available iron on the y-axis, depth on the x-axis, and the lighter color is going to be the control, darker color is going to be the cover crop. And the letters are going to indicate significance. So different letters mean they're significantly different. And yeah, and the error bars are standard error. So yeah, so what we saw was that there generally was more available iron in the cover crop field than there was in the control field. But this result wasn't replicated in the last year in 2020, which had about the same available iron between the cover crop and the natural ground cover control. So that was about 39 ppm. So that was interesting. It seemed like, the cover crop was changing the soil environment, at least to increase iron availability. And so now we're going to start moving into the plant. Okay. And so we only measured pear root iron in 2019. And for that one time point measurement, we saw that iron concentration in the roots, so yeah, was greater in the cover crop treatment than in the control. So, which seems to suggest that the iron that's more available in the soil is making its way at least into the roots of the pear. Yeah, so it seems like it's making it into the roots. And the root iron concentrations were much higher than the leaf iron. So we're going to go into the leaf iron next. And so based off the leaf iron, we didn't see that it was enhanced by the cover crop. And so for the leaf iron, we measured iron concentration in the leaves, and we also measured iron chlorosis through image analysis of the pear leaves as well. And so over the 3 years, and just for interpreting the figures, the red line on the figure is at 100 ppm, which is the recommended iron concentration you would want your leaves sitting at for pears for iron nutrition. And so there's a general upward trend over the 3 years, but between the treatments, between the control and the cover crop, we didn't see any significant differences. So it doesn't seem that the cover crop is enhancing the leaf iron. And so it seems that, it's increasing soil iron and it's getting to the roots, but based off the biology I was talking about earlier, it seems like it's hitting a transport limitation somewhere along that, the pathway. So yeah, so the iron isn't getting to where it needs to go in the leaf. Yeah, and then leaf chlorosis averaged about 20% for the cover crop and natural vegetation, so about the same. Okay, and then so for our conclusions, it did seem like the cover crop improved soil and root iron, but this didn't translate to pear iron nutrient status improving. And in terms of soil health benefits, in the 3 years that we were studying the cover crop, natural ground cover seemed to have similar benefits in terms of soil health compared to the seeded cover crop. And this may be because David already has, had a decade of, healthy soil practices. So the cover crop had less of a immediate impact on his system. And another good thing that we saw was that we didn't see any evidence for increased root competition. Instead, there was more pear roots in the cover crop treatment than the control. And also there was limited, there wasn't any detriment to like nitrogen and water status or water availability with the cover crop between the two fields. So that's also good. Oh, so yeah, you guys are here for the webinar today. And so for my acknowledgements, I want to thank my collaborators, Mostyn family, Rachel Elkins, and Asher Volder and the Volder Lab. And this project wouldn't have been possible without the CDFA Healthy Soils program and the California Pear Advisory Board. And the Fruit and Nut Research and Information Center for helping us host the meeting today. And so that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Juliana. We already have a couple questions, and then obviously we have some time for questions for both Juliana and David. So it looks like Rachel's already speaking some to this question, but maybe Juliana wants to jump in. The question is, how did the height of the cover crop affect sprays? Did the tall vegetation affect spray coverage? And can you speak to how many times you sprayed and how many times you mowed each year?
I'm going to pass that question along to David.
Okay, that's an easy one. Pretty much you sprayed 15, 20 times a year, every 4 days in the springtime. And the cover crop was not an impediment because it was mowed close or terminated by then. The discussion about the russet and the frost protection, we mow it close for the frost protection, and I use blight band for the russet and the blight threat and for the frost protection. So that's how I just manage that. And speaking to the organic material, I pulled my soil test from 2013, and those blocks were running 1.9% organic matter. That is only a couple of years into my transition. And in 2018, that same block went 4.4%. So it's been quite a change in that regard. And a little comment about it's essentially, even conventional, it was no till because I only cultivated every 4 or 5 years to level the ground. It's just a matter of getting more aggressive in what exactly is going on in there. Right now, the changes I plan to make is I need to treat the in-row orchard floor different than the under tree floor. Because I do not want the cover crop under the tree because of the interference in production. And so that and the pH thing is the driver right now. I've been fighting pH for 40 years here, and I've been putting like 300 pounds of Tiger 90 on a year almost this last 5 years, and it's only maintained it. And in fact, this last year, in the test block, I went 500 pounds per acre, and we just got the analysis back, and that did not change the pH from the year before. So I plan to band my Tiger 90 on now this next year, because I've done banding on before when I was conventional. So that to me is the killer on the iron trail. Is I'm running at a much too higher pH. I'd like to see 6.8, 6.9. I used to be able to do it when I was conventional, but not anymore. Not with putting all the crap on I do with the compost and stuff. So that's all I got to say about it. Anyway, I hope that answers something.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any other questions for either Juliana or David? Or if they thought of a question for Rachel or Astrid, we're all still here. Rachel is sharing some information. Rachel, do you just want to speak up and
Well, the only thing I wanted to mention was that David, I was really glad to see that he mentioned his Frost and Russet program involving blight ban, which is has been a major plus for especially for organic growers, because the conventional growers went with this information went to a program of basically a low volume no tillage with using glyphosate, which has its problems now with resistance, but in order to basically clean the orchard floor prior to frost and russet. And David has been using an biological control for that same purpose. And also I could mention on the acidification that we did work for quite a while using water run acids and furic. And David is using Tiger 90. And so growers have used a wide range of basically sulfur products to acidify water and soil in order to reduce pH for iron chlorosis. So it's just basically something that if you're prone due to your irrigation water or your and your soil type, that you're basically going to have to live with. There has been some information developed recently on rootstocks that might be genetically, phenotypically more able to show less iron chlorosis, and we hope that the breeding will help us with that in the future.
thanks, Rachel. Any questions from anyone else? If not, I do want to point out that we still have that poll up. If anyone hasn't gotten a chance to answer it, I'd really appreciate it. It's just really quick, 2 questions. Juliana would really appreciate having that data to add. So if you could just take a second and answer that, I would really appreciate that. I'm not seeing any other questions. Maybe Juliana and David, if you guys would be willing to put some contact information, if anyone has any questions going forward.
Yeah, sure.
Or if Juliana just wants to put hers and then she can pass anything
Yeah,
on.
there you go.
Rachel's got hers.
Best.
All right.
Take yours.
And Juliana's got hers there. So if anybody has questions for Juliana or for David, just let Juliana know and she can make sure it gets to him. They've been working together for a while now. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Juliana for any kind of final words she's got to say, or
Thanks for coming. It was
Yeah,
great being.
I got one quick thing to add.
Yeah,
I was
go
thinking
ahead,
about
David.
What changes I was going to make, and using a flail mower to terminate the cover crop instead of the disking, because I'm getting into a no-till situation. This last harvest for my walnuts was the first year I went a complete year without disking. I used the flail mower to pre-harvest to level the ground. And so that is a simple but major difference in how I operate as far as that goes. And the second comment is using the drill was really effective in placing the seed exactly where I wanted it. The pictures you showed of the drill was on in presentation was on a cultivated piece of a cultivated orchard. So it was clear of the cover crop, and then the drill was used. So there was no competition. In my orchard, the cover crop that was for there all year was still intact. And so the stand is not quite as vigorous as what you saw in the picture, but it's still early in the growth process. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. And it's supposed to rain this afternoon. So what the hell? That's all I got to say.
Yay.
Well, those sound like great concluding words.
Yeah.
thank you very much.
In the rain.
Yay, rain.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, all of you.
Thanks, everyone. We've got some comments or some contacts information in the chat. So if anyone has any further questions, Rachel's got her contact there and Juliana has hers. So please feel free to contact them going forward. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.